It began not with gold, but with a shortage. In the heart of ancient China during the Tang and Song dynasties, merchants faced a new kind of problem. Their trade routes stretched for thousands of miles, from the rice fields of the south to the silk markets of the north. Carrying coins was heavy, dangerous. A fortune in metal could sink a ship or break a man's back. So traders began leaving their coins in trusted houses in the cities. In return, they received thin sheets of paper, signed, stamped, and sealed with the mark of a banker or merchant guild. Each one said the same thing. This paper stands for silver. It wasn't money yet, but it was the beginning of something greater. Word spread. The notes moved faster than the coins themselves, and soon people realized they didn't need the silver at all. They just needed belief. By the 11th century, the emperor of the Song dynasty took notice. He saw a system born from the people and decided to make it his own. Under imperial decree, private notes were banned. The government would issue the first official paper currency in human history, the jiaozi. Printed on mulberry bark, adorned with red stamps and flowing dragons, the notes bore a promise from the emperor himself. By order of heaven, this paper shall be accepted as value. For the first time, money was no longer mined, but made. Across China's great cities, Kaifeng, Hangzhou, and Chengdu, shops began to trade paper instead of metal. Farmers paid taxes with ink, not silver. Soldiers received wages written on parchment. And merchants crossed the empire carrying only the weight of trust. But with this miracle came a temptation. Paper was easy to print, too easy. The emperor's ministers discovered that the more notes they made, the more wars they could fund, the more palaces they could build, the more wealth appeared, at least on paper. Sound familiar? Inflation began to spread like smoke. 1,000 strings of copper coins could not match a single sheet of royal paper. The value of trust itself began to weaken. People whispered, "Does heaven still stand behind the emperor's promise?" And slowly, belief, the invisible pillar of money, began to crack. By the 13th century, the Mongols swept across the empire. When Kublai Khan rose to power, he looked upon this system and smiled. He ordered a new currency, backed by nothing but authority. It was called Chow, made from the bark of mulberry trees and printed with black ink and a red imperial seal. Every merchant, every soldier, every farmer was forced to accept it by law. Kublai declared, "Those who refuse this money shall be punished by death." And thus, trust was no longer voluntary. It was commanded. The Chow spread across Asia, from the markets of Beijing to the ports of Persia. Marco Polo, when he arrived, could hardly believe it. He wrote, "These papers pass for gold." And with them, the great Khan makes himself the richest ruler in the world. It was the dawn of a new age, a world where value could be created with ink and fear, where promises replaced metal and power began to live on paper. The emperor's paper had changed everything, but it also revealed a dangerous truth. Once money could be printed, so could power. And power, as history would soon show, always wants more ink. When Marco Polo returned from the East, he brought back something far more valuable than silk or spice. He brought back an idea that money could exist without metal. In his journals, he described it like a miracle. They make paper money, and with it, they buy and sell as freely as if it were gold. Europe laughed. Kings and merchants dismissed the notion as fantasy. Paper? Money? Absurd. How could ink and bark hold value? But behind the laughter was a quiet fear, because they understood what it truly meant. If paper could replace gold, then the foundations of power could shift. Still, the seed was planted, and in the centuries that followed, it would take root. By the 14th century, Europe's trade routes pulsed with movement. Ships from Venice, caravans from Genoa, and merchants from the Hanseatic ports. But gold was scarce, and silver was hoarded by kings to fund endless wars. So traders began using handwritten notes, letters of exchange, each one a simple sentence of faith: I promise to pay. A merchant could leave coins in Florence and receive a signed promise to collect them in London. No gold had to travel, no swords had to guard it. Just the faith in a name and a signature. These were not yet banknotes, but they were the ancestors of every dollar, pound, and euro to come. In the bustling Italian cities of Florence and Venice, families like the Medici turned these promises into power. They realized that money was not wealth itself. It was movement. The Medici perfected the art of accounting. Their ledgers became sacred books where faith was measured in numbers. A merchant's worth was no longer in his chest of coins, but in the pages of a notebook locked in a Florentine vault. Every promise written was a small act of creation. Every loan, a quiet reshaping of destiny. And slowly, Europe began to see what China had discovered centuries earlier: that value lives in belief, not in metal. By the 1600s, that belief had become too powerful to contain. In Amsterdam, merchants built one of the first true financial institutions, the Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609. It held real coins in its vaults, but it issued paper receipts to depositors. Soon, those papers began to circulate on their own. People realized they didn't need to visit the bank. The paper itself was the money. The promise had taken form. And across the sea, a new empire watched closely. England. The wars of the 17th century had left the English crown drowning in debt. The government needed funds, quickly. So in 1694, a group of wealthy merchants and goldsmiths offered a deal. They would lend the government £1.2 million and in return receive royal permission to issue banknotes, paper that said, "I promise to pay the bearer." Thus was born the Bank of England. For the first time in Western history, a private institution had the legal power to create money out of promises. A revolution had begun quietly, with ink and seals instead of swords. At first, people doubted. How could they trust paper more than gold? But slowly, confidence grew. The king's face printed on each note became a new kind of symbol, not of divine power, but of national trust. Traders, shopkeepers, soldiers, they all began to see paper not as deception, but as efficiency. It was lighter than coins, faster than caravans, and infinitely easier to multiply. And as the notes multiplied, so did ambition. Governments realized they could fund wars, build fleets, and expand empires with promises alone. But with every new note, the distance between wealth and reality grew wider. Gold still sat in vaults, but there was never enough of it to match the paper flying through the air. And yet, no one stopped, because paper was addictive. It felt limitless. And for the first time, money was no longer a tool, it was a force. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe had entered the age of the paper promise. Kings ruled with debt. Merchants ruled with trust. And the world's first financial storms were already forming on the horizon. The old empires of metal had fallen silent. The new empires of ink were rising. And once again, humanity stood at the edge of its own creation, unaware of how fragile it had become. Because now the only thing keeping the system alive was belief itself. And belief can vanish overnight. It began quietly, with ledgers, seals, and promises. But those promises were no longer personal. They now carried the weight of nations. The year was 1609, and in the busy harbor city of Amsterdam, merchants faced a problem that would define the future of finance. Every trader used different coins: German thalers, Spanish reals, French écus, each with its own weight and purity. Commerce was chaos. So the merchants created something new, a place where trust could be standardized, the Bank of Amsterdam. Here, every deposit was recorded, every coin weighed, and every promise written into an official book. No royal crown, no church blessing, just math, order, and belief. Soon, traders realized they didn't even need to withdraw their coins. They could simply transfer ownership through the books. A number moved from one name to another, and wealth changed hands without a single coin leaving the vault. For the first time, money existed as information. As the Dutch Empire rose, the Bank of Amsterdam became the beating heart of its global trade. Ships sailed with spices and silver, but true power flowed through ledgers. The city became a laboratory for modern finance, the birthplace of stocks, bonds, and national debt. In Amsterdam, people discovered something extraordinary: that a promise, if trusted by enough people, could shape the world. And this idea, this dangerous, beautiful idea, would soon infect every empire. Across the sea, England was at war again, with France, with debt, and with itself. The 17th century was an age of kings losing heads and governments losing money. Wars were expensive, revolutions were worse. So, in 1694, a group of wealthy merchants approached the English crown with a proposal that would change the nature of power forever. They offered to lend the government £1.2 million, an unimaginable fortune, to fund its wars. In return, they wanted something far greater than gold. They wanted the right to issue money. Thus, the Bank of England was born, a private institution with royal approval to create paper promises on behalf of the state. Each note carried a simple phrase: "I promise to pay the bearer on demand." It sounded harmless, but it was revolutionary, because now money creation was no longer in the hands of kings or priests. It belonged to bankers. And those bankers, with a stroke of a pen, could decide the fate of nations. At first, people hesitated. They preferred coins, heavy, visible, real. But the wars did not wait, and the state needed more money than any vault could hold. So, paper flowed like rivers. Receipts became currency. Debt became wealth. The line between promise and possession blurred, and few noticed how dangerous that was. For the first time in history, governments could spend money that didn't exist, as long as people believed it did. By the early 1700s, this new financial magic spread like fire across Europe. Scotland tried it. France tried it. Everywhere, rulers discovered the same intoxicating truth. You didn't need to find gold. You could simply print faith. In France, a Scottish economist named John Law convinced the king that paper notes could rebuild the nation's economy. He founded the Banque Générale and flooded Paris with currency backed by little more than confidence. For a while, it worked. Commerce exploded. Markets soared. People believed. Until they didn't. When the truth emerged that there wasn't enough silver to redeem the notes, panic spread. Crowds stormed the banks, paper burned in the streets, and faith, once again, collapsed into dust. The illusion had cracked, but the system survived. Because by then, people no longer wanted a world without credit. They couldn't imagine life without the promise. The Bank of England watched and learned. It tightened control, issued fewer notes, and slowly became the world's model for stability, the quiet engine of empire. Its paper financed wars, colonies, and industrial dreams. Every cannon fired, every railway built, every ship launched, all of it began not with metal, but with ink. And behind every note there was not gold, but a nation's belief that its debt would be repaid someday. A belief just strong enough to hold. By the 18th century, Europe had built something entirely new, a world powered by promises. Coins still clinked in pockets, but real money now lived in vaults, in ledgers, and in laws. It was invisible, mathematical, and unstoppable. Empires no longer conquered lands for gold. They conquered trust. Trust had built the system. Control would perfect it. By the dawn of the 19th century, the great empires of Europe had mastered the art of the paper promise. But they had also discovered its most powerful secret. Whoever controlled credit controlled destiny. The wars of Napoleon had left nations in ruin. Armies marched not for glory, but for repayment. Across the continent, kings borrowed from banks, and banks borrowed from belief. It was no longer gold that powered empires. It was debt. Every war bond, every government loan was a quiet agreement between rulers and financiers. You keep us alive today, and we'll give you the future. The paper promise had become a weapon. In London, the Bank of England's vaults were nearly empty, yet trade flourished. People no longer asked to see the gold. They trusted the system instead. That trust became invisible scaffolding, holding up nations that could no longer afford themselves. The British pound became the world's reference point, not because it was the strongest metal, but because it was the strongest story. And that story was about to be rewritten in numbers. By the mid-1800s, the industrial world had created machines faster than men could think. Telegraphs carried words across oceans. Railways carried goods across continents. And money, now nothing more than paper, moved faster than ever. To fuel this new world, governments needed constant expansion. Factories needed credit. Workers needed wages, and so the printing presses never stopped. Money was no longer a symbol of value, it was the engine of growth. Every new note printed promised tomorrow's wealth, but borrowed it from today's reality. And as long as the people kept believing, the illusion worked. Then came America, a new empire built on the ashes of old promises. In 1913, the United States created the Federal Reserve, a central bank designed not to store gold, but to manage belief. It was a masterpiece of financial architecture, a network of private banks given public power. The same pattern repeated. Private credit became national currency, debt became identity, and every crisis became an opportunity to print more faith. When the First World War erupted, governments across the world abandoned gold altogether. They printed promises faster than bullets. Paper bought soldiers, paper bought guns, paper bought silence. And when peace finally came, there was nothing left to back it all, except signatures. The link between money and metal was broken. But few noticed, because life went on, shops reopened, markets grew. The story held. By the 20th century, central banks ruled quietly behind the curtain. Their weapon was no longer gold or even paper. It was policy. Interest rates became the new commandments. Governments rose and fell on the invisible hand of printed confidence. When inflation threatened, they raised rates. When economies slowed, they lowered them. The cycle continued, a pendulum swinging between control and chaos. Each generation believed the system was stable, that someone, somewhere, truly understood it. But no one did, because the system was never designed to end, only to expand. In 1971, a single decision sealed the fate of the global economy. President Richard Nixon announced that the US dollar would no longer be tied to gold. From that moment, money became pure imagination, value born from nothing but faith. The paper promise was complete. Now every dollar, pound, yen, and euro was a story without an anchor. Governments could print as they pleased. Central banks could manipulate at will. And the people were left to believe. The world that emerged after was faster, richer, and far more fragile. Debt became normal. Credit became oxygen. A family's home, a nation's budget, a corporation's empire, all built on invisible ink. The emperors of paper had become the architects of the modern world. But they had also created a paradox. The more they printed, the less it was worth. And yet, they could never stop, because to stop printing would be to admit the truth, that the promise was always an illusion. Today, we live in that illusion. A world where numbers on a screen decide the fate of millions, where markets rise not on value but on emotion, where the same trust that once built temples now builds debt. Money has no face, no sound, no weight, only movement. And in that movement, we see both the brilliance and the madness of everything humanity has created. Because, once upon a time, we made money to represent trust. Now, money decides what we can trust.